So a party wins an election, and it's going to claim, of course, a mandate based on that election. That's what parties do. That's what an electoral mandate is. It's a statement by winning candidates and by the winning party that they have a mandate from the American people to do what it is that they campaigned on. Why would you make that statement, and what does that electoral mandate do, and what is it based on? Well, of course, the reason why you make that statement is because you want to take that electoral victory and launch it into the period where you actually have governing going on, where you have control over the levers of power, so that you can use those to further the agenda that the party has and to act on the things that the party leaders have put at the top of the agenda. So you say, we won, and elections have consequences, and we won because the American people want what we have promised. As I've indicated before, that's kind of a double-edged sword because when you actually give people the things that you've promised them, they might end up not liking them. The other reason to claim a mandate is because elections aren't a clarifying practice. They're not a clarifying outcome, but claiming a mandate does provide, at least rhetorically, some kind of clarity. Now, why would I say that it's not a clarifying outcome? The reason why it's not a clarifying outcome is because, okay, we do get winners, right? It's clear and the count is done and we end up knowing who the winners are. It may take a while, right? I'm actually doing this lecture on Sunday, November 1st, 2 days before the presidential and congressional elections. It may be a while before we know the outcome of all of those elections. There are potentially going to be runoffs in the 2 Georgia Senate races, so we might not know until January or I think February what the outcome of those are going to be, but we do eventually know. So the result becomes clear at some point, but what does the actual count of votes mean? Let's say we end up with 53 Democratic Senate seats and 250 Democratic House seats and a Democratic administration, President Biden. That's going to be claimed by the Democratic Party as a mandate, but as a mandate for what? As a mandate for everything that they said they were going to do, as a mandate for their general approach, as a mandate for, essentially doing whatever they think is right with the levers of power that they've been handed. Of course, the party is going to say, the American people want what we're offering, and we're going to give it to them. But give it to them, cautiously so that they don't react against it, so that in the 2022 midterm elections, the Democrats can retain control of Congress, and in the 2024 elections, the Democrats can retain control over the executive branch. But the reason why it's not that clear is, what does it really mean? Let's just take apart the various components of an electoral victory and even of a wave election, right? Let's say, for the sake of just this discussion, and it may or may not happen, I don't know, it's 2 days before the election, but let's just say that there is a blue wave in the 2020 elections, and we get a strengthened House majority for the Democrats, we get a flip of the Senate to Democratic control, and we get a Joe Biden presidency, a Democratic administration. How did that happen? How did all of that happen? And does that mean what the Democratic Party is almost certainly going to claim that it means, which is that there's a broad mandate for their policies and for their approach, that the American people want what the Democratic Party has offered them? The reason why it doesn't mean that is because, of course, in Congress, there is no election for Congress. You don't get a majority of seats in the Senate or the House of Representatives because you got the most votes overall in all of those elections. The American people don't get to vote for Congress, right? You get to vote for one senator at a time, and not even every time, right? Every 2 years, two of the 3 elections, you get to vote for a senator. This time we got to vote in Oregon, we got to vote for one of our Senate seats. I think that we don't vote next time, and then the time after that we do. You get to vote for your one member of the House of Representatives every 2 years. So you get 1 or 2 choices of the 535 members of Congress every 2 years. You don't ever get to vote for the whole House of Representatives or the whole of the Senate. We don't have a proportional system. If 70% of the votes cast for House seats are given to Democratic candidates, That doesn't mean that 70% of the seats in the House of Representatives will be held by the Democratic Party. It could be more or it could be less. And the reasons why it could be more or less have to do with sometimes with gerrymandering, but also just with vote distributions. There's a concept in electoral politics known as wasted votes. Wasted votes are those votes which are unnecessary for winning the election. Right? Technically, as soon as you have 50% plus one in a two-person race, every other vote above that is a wasted vote. So let's say you get reelected with 75% of the vote. 24% of the voters, their votes were wasted. Now, that doesn't mean they're wasted and that they're no good to have. It just means that you can build up a vote total that doesn't tell you more about your victory. It's also possible that with a few close races and some blowout races, that the outcome in terms of vote totals and the outcome in terms of total number of seats are going to be different, right? You could end up with 51 Senate seats, even though you got fewer votes overall in the Senate races that were up. And this is actually relatively common in the last 20 years, and it's particularly possible and likely in the Senate, especially when the Republicans have control, because the Senate seats go 2 to each state, regardless of their population. And typically, smaller, more rural states lean Republican, and so you can get a bunch of votes in the Senate with not a bunch of votes in the overall American electorate. The confirmation of the latest Supreme Court justice, the senators who voted for Amy Coney Barrett represented 18 million fewer people than the senators who voted against. And that's just one of the weird kind of anti-democratic, dysfunctional, weird pieces about our Senate. But that is the way our system is set up. And so you could win the Senate with fewer votes. You could control the Senate by representing far less than 50% of the American population. The same thing can happen in the House of Representatives. You can win more votes and still have fewer seats. Or let's say that you control a slim majority, 220 seats in the House of Representatives. You could do so with 65 or 70% of the votes cast in those races, because the American people don't get to vote for Congress as a whole directly. There are other systems where there's proportional representation, where if there's 100 seats in the Senate and people vote for, instead of individual candidates in individual states, they voted for parties, then there would be a proportional outcome. If 54% of Americans voted for the Democratic Party and 46% of Americans voted for the Republican Party, the Senate would be made up of 54 Democrats and 46 Republicans. That's known as proportional representation. We don't have that system. In a proportional system, an electoral outcome is more clear, right? When you have a majority of votes that translates into a majority of seats, it at least says, okay, that more people, the majority of voters, wanted this party to be in control. We don't have that. What it means when you have a majority in one or both houses of Congress is that simply your party was able to win more individual elections. How does that translate into a mandate? Even if you end up with more votes than the other side, the Democratic Party ends up with more votes and more seats, or the Republican Party ends up with more votes or more seats, you really still can't say that the American people wanted that party to have control over one or both of those chambers of Congress, because the American people never get to weigh in. It's individual voters in individual districts or states. So claiming an electoral mandate for legislative elections is very much about essentially treating the outcome as though it means that there's been this national vote, when in fact all of the elections for Congress are local, either at the state or even smaller at the local district. But you don't want to just say, okay, well, we control a majority in both houses because we won more of the individual races, and all that means is we're better at winning these individual races. As party leaders, you want to be able to say, well, the American people want what we have, and we're going to give it to them. We have control over the levers of power. So really what an electoral mandate is, and I'll air quote it with my fingers because it's air quoted in the title of the lecture, is essentially saying, well, we were able to win a majority of seats, and that gives us control over these levers of power, and we're going to use them. Now, however, even party leaders know that that's rhetorical, and what does it really mean? Does it mean, for example, that your promise is about healthcare, or your promise is about environmental policy, or your promise is about tax and spending policy? Did the American people vote for and want action on that? One of the things that's problematic for party leaders is that they understand that controlling the individual houses of Congress, or both houses of Congress, is about winning individual votes, not about essentially winning a national referendum on their policy. They also know that it's really hard to disentangle what a victory means from the policy promises that were made. And this is even as true when we have a single office, the presidency. When one candidate wins over the other one, what does that mean the American people actually want? What does it mean they voted for? If there was a single issue that dominated the campaign and that both candidates essentially made the centerpiece of their campaign, and one candidate wins and the other one doesn't, then we would have a mandate for that issue and for nothing else, essentially. Presidential elections are very rarely about a single issue, and in fact, the voters who give a president the margin of victory are those groups that will put you over the top in the key swing states that give you 270 plus electoral votes, are a diverse group of people. When Donald Trump won the election in 2016, who gave him that election, and what was the message of the voters who handed him that election? Well, a lot of it's up to interpretation, because any given group of voters could be said to have been the critical mass that was necessary to get over the top. Was it high school educated white blue-collar workers? Was it evangelicals? Was it suburban women? Was it the group of Hispanic and African American voters who actually voted for Trump? Who was it? All of those groups of voters were important, especially because Trump won in 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, by a collection of 70,000 votes. Any one of those groups could have been the key component to those extra 70,000 votes. What Trump did, and what all presidents really do, is they decide essentially what their mandate means. They decide who their key group of voters happens to be. They turn a victory into a more specific mandate. But it's one of the things that their advisors attempt to do is they attempt to figure out what it really does mean. Like, you win the election. What did that election actually mean? It's very difficult to determine. Absolutely the case when you control one or both houses of Congress. It's practically impossible to tell what it means that the American people wanted from you. When, after the 2008 election, the Democratic Party controlled the presidency with the victory of Barack Obama and controlled both houses of Congress, did that mean that the American people wanted vigorous, deep healthcare reform? Well, the Democratic Party leadership was divided about that question. Some thought that the new administration and the majority in Congress should focus solely on economic recovery. Others thought that they should move hard on healthcare reform. Ultimately, President Obama and the Obama administration decided to go all in on a major healthcare reform effort, even though there were a number of party leaders who were warning against this. And they were warning against it for exactly the thing that turned out to happen, was that the 2010 midterm elections were a red wave that gave control over both houses of Congress to the Republican Party. And so for the next 6 years, the Obama administration had an oppositional Congress and had a very, very difficult time getting almost anything done. So did the 2008 election mean that the American people wanted the Democratic Party to move on an important healthcare reform effort or not? Impossible to know. Even though there was a backlash in the 2010 election, that doesn't mean that the Obama administration misread what the American people wanted from that 2008 victory. It could have been that they wanted healthcare reform, and just as I've said numerous times in this module, when they got it, they were displeased, or when they got it, enough groups were displeased that they became an active political force to try to push back against that. It doesn't take a majority of Americans to react negatively to something like the Affordable Care Act to launch energy for a vigorous counter-political movement. In fact, it's often just a very energetic and dedicated and unified minority that pushes back against that kind of policy victory. But how do we know? If the Republican Party retains control over the Senate after the elections on Tuesday, but elects a Democratic president, does that mean what I am certain the Republican leadership is going to claim is that the American people want some kind of check on the Biden administration? It doesn't mean that, because the reason why the Senate would remain in Republican hands is because the Republicans won enough elections, state by state, to keep a majority of seats in the Senate. That gives them the ability to be a check on a Biden administration. But does that mean that they have a mandate to do so? Of course, you're going to say that you have a mandate. If Biden wins the presidency and the Republicans control the Senate, or if Trump wins the presidency and the Democrats win control of the Senate, the leaders are going to say, well, the American people want a check on power. There is no such thing, really, as what the American people want. Even when they elect a president who wins not only the national popular vote, but the Electoral College vote, that still doesn't tell that president, that administration, what it is that the American people want. So an electoral mandate is a rhetorical tool that is used by party leaders to say, well, elections have consequences, which they do. They confer seats and levers of power to particular individuals and to a particular party, which is correct, and you're allowed to and would be foolish not to use those levers of power, using them cautiously, of course, always with the next election in mind. But there is no such thing as a mandate. The only time you could say that there's an electoral mandate for anything is when there's a ballot measure. And we don't have ballot measures at the federal level, we have them at the state level in many states. When a ballot measure wins, we could say, okay, that's a popular mandate for that policy. For example, here in Portland, if the measure to create a civilian oversight board over the police passes, that measure passes, we could say that that's what the people of Portland want, right? Now, even in the case of a ballot measure, it's a little tricky because a ballot measure is a yes or no choice. Let's say that the measure for the Metro transportation plan and tax fails. There's a no vote on that. That no vote could mean that people living in the Portland metropolitan area don't want this transportation plan to go into action. They're fine with the way things are, or they just don't like this. Or it could mean that they didn't like the specifics of that one, but they like the idea of that ballot measure, like the idea of a transportation plan that expands public transportation infrastructure, that makes sure that we integrate the growing suburbs with the urban core, but that the voters didn't like this particular plan, either because it was too centered around one area, or because it was paid for with a payroll tax, or because the opposition had better arguments than, they were better funded than the pro side. We don't know what, even with the ballot measure victory, we don't exactly know what the voters want when they vote yes or no. Though a ballot measure is a clearer mandate. Okay? So move back over to candidate elections and the question becomes even muddier. And let's just say that the Democratic Party does take control over the Senate. Does that mean that the American people want unified government, and let's say Biden wins the presidency, does that mean the American people want unified government? We don't know. In the 2022 midterm elections, the American people will have kind of a chance to decide whether or not to evaluate unified government by voting to either retain Democratic control over both houses of Congress or to not. But again, as a voter and as blocks of voters, you don't get to decide the partisan makeup of either chamber of Congress. You don't get to say, well, you know what, 2 years of unified Democratic control have been disastrous, and so I want to make sure that the Republicans recapture the Senate so they can be a check on this Democratic administration. You don't get to vote for that. You get to vote, possibly not at all, but you get to vote for only one senator, and maybe you don't even get to vote for that one senator in a state that matters. Like that, you know, if you're in a safe Republican or Democratic state, whichever side you vote for, that seat is going to go to that particular party. So elections have very unclear meaning. Now they have true outcome. The outcome is, it's clear who has this number of seats. We're going to know how many Democrats and Republicans are in the House, how many Democrats and Republicans are in the Senate. We're going to know who the president is. Eventually, we're going to know all of these things. It might take a little while, but we're eventually going to know. But what we don't know is, what does it mean? Party leaders and analysts will spend time doing a post-mortem evaluation. Both winners and losers will look at what available data there is. They'll look at exit polls. They'll use their own intuition. They'll look at the distribution of victories. They'll look at the ultimate makeup. Like, let's say that the Democratic Party ends up with 56 seats in the Senate. That's going to mean something to Democratic and Republican leaders. They're going to read something into that. Let's say that it's only 51 Democratic seats, or let's say that it's 50 and then the vice president gets to cast the tie-breaking vote. Those are going to mean different things. Even when you win, you have to figure out what it means, and certainly if you lost, because you're already now looking towards the next election to try to go from being a loser to being a winner in the next election, you're going to try to figure out what that means. And you're going to behave during the next 2 years according to what you think the outcome of the election means. So elections are important, obviously. They have significant consequences in terms of who has control over certain levers of power. Their meaning is highly disputed. But a mandate is a claim that an electoral outcome means a certain thing. And one thing I will predict with certainty is that whatever the outcome of this particular election, both parties are going to immediately be saying, here's what it means. And there's an important political reason for making that statement and carving out that territory, because claiming that will give you some leeway to use the levers of power that you actually do have, right? To stick with the one example, if the Republican Party retains control over the Senate and Joe Biden wins the presidency, the Republican Party is going to say that means the American people want the Republican Party to serve as a check on the Biden administration. And when they do the kind of obstruction that they were going to do no matter what, they're going to have this rhetorical cover to say, well, this is what the American people want. The American people want a check on power, right? If the Democrats take control of the Senate and Joe Biden wins the election, the Democratic Party is going to say, the American people want unified government. They want us to move on our priorities. They want us to move quickly and efficiently and effectively. It may or may not mean that either, but they're going to say that. So I'm confident that however the election turns out, that both sides are going to make claims about what that meaning is. That's just normal politics, and while it's a kind of a inaccurate, disingenuous claim, it absolutely has to be made, and it serves an important rhetorical purpose.